This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen. Out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theatre's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates. By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian. It's Halloween.
Hello and welcome once again to the Cine-Files. My name is Steve Morris. I'm a filmmaker and directing instructor on Los Angeles, California.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Roca. I'm a voiceover artist, host, writer, producer over at Collider and on a number of other shows. And occasionally an actor.
And normally I say that each week we enter in the world of a great film, but that is not what we're doing this week.
No.
We are doing something a little different. And the reason we're doing something different is that we have finally decided to tackle the mountain that is Citizen Kane.
Dun, dun, dun.
This is something we talked about it from the day we started talking about the Cine-Files, and I think I more than you was like, no, we got to wait.
Yes.
Let's get some time in. It's a lot. And in the last few weeks, we've been talking about, well, how do we want to approach this? And I think both of us felt that we had to approach this differently from anything else we've done because Citizen Kane is almost universally ranked as among, if not the greatest film ever made.
Yeah, and if people want to know, kind of get a window or a look behind the curtain of our friendship, Orson Welles and Citizen Kane is one of the building blocks of our friendship because when we were first getting to know each other, it was one of the first movies that we discussed and talked about and found a common connection and kinship with because of our love of the film.
And so here's what we decided to do. Today, we are not going to talk about Citizen Kane. Okay. And what we're going to talk about is the great Orson Welles. Mm-hmm. You know, normally when we introduce a new director, a new actor, we will sometimes go into some biographical material. And Orson Welles' story is so big that we felt like, you know what, let's just talk about Orson today. And then in our next episode, we're actually going to break down Citizen Kane. That might go over 2 episodes, depending on how long it goes. And then we've decided to do something which we talked about quite a bit, which is we're going to do a commentary track on the entire movie. Yeah. So this might be the next whole month is going to be Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's worth it.
And for those of you who've said, like, listening to your podcast is almost like a film school, a pseudo film school. This is, in essence, like doing a particular section of the syllabus we're going to spend on Citizen Kane. And because it is a film that needs to be analyzed and understood, and for those of you who've seen it before and love it, great. For those of you who've been maybe waiting to watch it, a reason to watch it, now is your time. And for those of you who maybe don't think it's that greatest film, maybe you'll give us a little bit of leeway here to convince you to look at it in a different way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so, without further ado, let's talk about the great Orson Welles.
Yeah.
Do you remember what your first knowledge of Orson Welles is? Like, where did you first discover this name, this person?
I probably remember reading something about him as I was getting into film in my teenage years and something about Citizen Kane. And I remember because I would get like Premiere Magazine or I would get whatever the film magazines were in the bookstore. Like I would stand in the book. I was one of those a-holes who would stand in the bookstore and read because I couldn't afford it. We were very poor growing up. I didn't have money to buy movie magazines. Right. And some of them were imported from England. So they were like, double the price or whatever. So it's very difficult. So I would stand and read, and so I remember getting into film, loving film at a young age. And like, I was voracious in my reading of like, what do I look at next? What do I watch next? And Orson Welles was a name that popped up over and over again because it just kind of hit all the buttons for me, checked all the boxes for me. He's a Shakespeare guy. He's a theater guy, a voiceover radio guy. And then boom, he was a film director. And then I remember renting the film from Video World one day when I was sick, took it home, watched it with a couple of other films as well, and that film absolutely devastated me in the world. Like it's like when you see that scene in Godfather, The Godfather, when Michael Corleone, Al Pacino sees Apollonia for the first time in that Italian village, that's what it was like for me to watch the film. I was like, I have no idea what I just watched, but it's changed my life. I knew immediately, instinctively, organically, that it had changed my life, and I have never gotten enough of Orson Welles ever since.
Yeah, it's funny. So my first experience with Orson is completely bizarre.
Okay.
So when I was a kid, I was a comic book collector, and my dad would bring home Superman comics. And at one point, I think it was for my 9th or 10th birthday, he brought home a big book that was a compilation. It was Superman from the 30s to the 70s, and I still have it. And it starts with Action Comics #1 and goes through like these are the best issues of Superman of the year. And in one of them, which was in like 1940, Superman meets up with this radio star, Orson Welles.
What?
Yes. And it's right after War of the Worlds had happened. And that Superman, everyone thought that Orson Welles was lying about this big thing that was happening. Right. And in fact, it was the truth. And so it's a Superman Orson Welles adventure. And then the next place that I found out about
When
him.
can we get that greenlit?
I don't, right? So I saw, okay, there's this guy who's this actor. That's all I knew about him when I'm 10 or 11 or something. And then it's funny that now I love audiobooks. Well, the beginning of that love was I used to listen to old radio shows. So I would go to the library in junior high and I would check out these albums, big albums, and I would listen to the Green Hornet and Burton's and Allen and You Bet Your Life and all these shows, including The Shadow, and I heard War of the Worlds. So I heard both of those probably at 12 or 13, and that's how I knew who Orson Welles was. And then of course, growing up when we did, you saw him places.
Yes.
It was on the Merv Griffin show, or he's in the Muppet movie, or all these places that I had seen. And so I'd seen this guy.
So maybe I need to adjust that. That's probably my first exposure to him, but I didn't understand who he was.
Well, how could you?
Right.
How could
10,
you?
11, 12.
And then it wasn't until I think I was in college, probably 19 or 20, that I did exactly what you did, is I watched Citizen Kane. And I remember just being, I don't think I could reckon with it the first time I saw it. It takes a while. I knew it was something really important and we'll talk about this when we talk more about the movie. I believe that while it is both one of the most influential films at all time, and also there's nothing like it.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
It's completely its own thing.
Yep. And has influenced so many other films afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. So Orson was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He had affluent parents, but it doesn't sound like things were so good for him. No. His parents split up. His dad was an alcoholic. His mom, he was with his mom. She played piano. He learned piano. And one of the things we're going to find out about Orson Welles is that he tells all sorts of stories about himself that may or may not be true. It's very hard to figure out. He's a trickster and a magician and an illusionist. And almost all the time, his stories are better than what the reality is.
Absolutely. And rightly so.
Oh, yeah.
As a storyteller, master storyteller, why shouldn't he create incredible yarns about himself?
So he says he was well on his way to being a concert pianist and that he would have been one of the great pianists of all time.
Of course, yes.
But then when his mother died, which she died when he was 10 or something, very young, he never played piano again.
Right.
Yeah. Now, is that true? I don't really know.
Who knows?
Yeah. Right. He ends up at a place called the Todd School. Well, at first he traveled around the world with his dad. Yeah. And so he was in Morocco. He was in Spain. He was in Hong Kong with his father as a young kid, living a very, very strange life with his sort of alcoholic, sounds like fairly tough dad.
And he was incredible, but he was intelligent from the beginning. He was a genius.
No question about it.
From birth.
Yeah. And it's interesting. They moved to Chicago, and his dad was living with a guy named Maurice Bernstein. And I just think that name Bernstein is this is a really important person in his life. Sure. And he ends up at the Todd School for Boys, and I picture this Orson Welles at the Todd School. This is Rushmore. He's Max.
Yeah.
Because he was doing plays. They just basically went, we can't control this person. We're going to let him do whatever he wants. There was a radio station at the Todd School, so he started doing his first radio plays. Right. It sounds like he ran the school. And in particular, there's this guy named Roger Hill, who was his real mentor.
Okay.
And at 15, he told his dad, I will never see you again unless you stop drinking.
Wow. And
his dad did not stop drinking. And his dad died when Orson was 15.
Wow.
And he asked Roger Hill, his mentor, this great teacher at the Todd School, will you be my guardian? And he said no. And so Maurice Bernstein, his guy his father lived with, that became his guardian.
How interesting.
Yeah, his childhood and his life, is like nobody else. Nobody lived a life like Orson Welles.
Well, most geniuses are this way, right? Mozart was this way. Amadeus had such an interesting life, overbearing father, took him everywhere, like it says in the movie, like a dancing monkey to perform for everything. But he was incredibly intelligent about the music, This sounds to me like Orson was very self-aware or self-actualized at a very young age.
Well, and I think it sounds like no one controlled him.
Mm-hmm.
He just did what he was going to do. And what's interesting too, and this is something we'll get to when we talk about Citizen Kane, is he seems like a person who was in a lot of pain, and was covering up a lot of that pain with a lot of arrogance and bluster and all sorts of stuff. At 16, when he graduated from the Todd School, he gets accepted to Harvard at 16, refuses.
At 16?
Yep. And decides instead to travel around Europe on a donkey cart to practice his painting. This is true. I mean, this is true? This is true.
All right.
Now, of course, Orson says he would have been one of the great painters.
Of course.
And he ends up, and how much money he had, and how was he doing this, and how was he living? We don't really know. He ends up at the Gate Theatre in Dublin, walks into the theater and says, "I am the great Orson Welles. I have been on stage across the world. I have been on Broadway, on the London stage. You should put me in your theater." And they go, and he says they totally believed him.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, the two guys who ran the Gate Theatre said, we didn't believe him at all, but he was so fascinating that we hired him. And that's how he started his acting career.
Why not?
At like 17 or something in Dublin.
Mm-hmm.
He acts there for a while, acts down in London, and then he returns to the U.S. And in the U.S., and again, this guy's kind of just drifting around. And he's only 18.
Was experiencing the world.
Yeah.
Right? This is going to influence all his work afterwards. But this is him experiencing the world.
Yeah.
Most people don't leave more than, a few blocks down the street for a majority of their lives until they become adults and can afford to travel the world. This man was traveling since he was a baby. And so that's incredible, or a child rather. That's incredible. And that changes your perspective on everything and how you approach any interaction, I imagine.
And I think the fundamental thing with him is he does not see rules.
Right.
He doesn't go, "Oh, this is what you're supposed to do."
Right.
He goes, "I want to do this. I will go do this."
This would begin the main pillar of his tragedy.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. The pillar of his tragedy. Because this is what's so sad. I mean, this is such a sad story. And it is at once, he is unbelievably lucky, unbelievably unlucky, unbelievably brilliant, and creates these amazing things, and unbelievably self-destructive.
Yes.
And it's all wrapped up in one crazy person.
Yeah, and just plain destructive.
Yeah. He meets Thornton Wilder, and Thornton Wilder says, "This is the most interesting person I've ever met." And so he gets him in touch with a theater company, ends up in a repertory company in New York, and very quickly goes to acting on Broadway.
Yeah. What a surprise.
Yeah, just like that. I mean, really, really fast. And at the same time, he starts doing radio. And this is, again, this other thing we're going to see from Orson. He is never going to do just one thing.
Yeah.
He's going to be doing 3 or 4 things at the same time all the time.
Sounds familiar. Yes.
Yeah. And he's acting in Romeo and Juliet on Broadway. I think he's playing Tybalt.
Yeah.
And John Houseman sees him and goes, "Who is this guy?"
Who is this guy?
Mr. Wells.
Mr. Wells.
And he becomes while he's doing theater, he becomes one of the biggest stars on radio. Yeah. And it's not just that he's doing The Shadow, which he did, but he's doing narration over here and an old man over here and a young kid over here and playing Romeo and playing he doesn't even know. He literally would show up and they would just hand him a script. He doesn't know what he's playing that day, and that's what he'd start doing.
Well, the gifted ones can do that. And having done my show, Cast of Characters, and then the show I did after with Yuri over at Geek and Sundry, interviewing the great voiceover actors. The great voiceover actors can be handed a piece the right before they walk into a booth and are immediately creating a character as they're walking, as they're looking, before they put the paper down, and as they start, immediately they create like 10 different characters, 10 different directions they can go in. And the great ones can do that because their imagination is endless. And I imagine the same thing was true for Wells. And if you watch that documentary that's on the Citizen Kane Blu-ray,
Right.
when they talk about, which is one of the greatest documentaries I've ever seen
It's
about
fantastic.
him. It's 90 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes, but he talks about the fact that he had an ambulance on call for him in New York the whole time I was doing radio. So because it wasn't illegal to hire an ambulance to take you from radio booth to radio booth with the ambulance and the siren going, so you wouldn't sit in traffic and you wouldn't have to wait through a taxi. The ambulance would take you from place to place. And at that time, it wasn't legal. You know why? Because no one would think to do something terrible like that. But Orson, in his narcissism, had no problem doing that. And so this is the exchange for the greatness.
Yeah, he doesn't care about rules.
Does not.
Yeah, he would go, and at this point, the Federal Theater Project had started, and he was working on Voodoo Macbeth, which was an all African American cast of Macbeth set in the Caribbean. They were doing it up in Harlem. Yeah. Nothing had ever been done like this before.
And there is footage of that in the documentary. Yeah. And this is what's revolutionary too, Steve. The Federal Theater, we should talk about that. Federal Theater Project was a thing initiated by FDR, part of the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to get the arts moving, to fund projects, to do the arts. You know, if you see the movie Cradle Will Rock, that's kind of loose interpretation of what happened with this thing. But yeah, the Federal Theater Project was to initiate arts, and Wells took advantage. Again, here's a situation. He takes advantage of getting this money, creating this thing. And this, what we're talking about, 1930s, an all-black production on Broadway.
Up in Harlem, actually.
Harlem of Macbeth, done in a voodoo style. It is as revolutionary as you could imagine it being in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And the guts to do it a kid in his 20s.
Yeah, he's like 21, 22.
Insanity.
It's crazy. And by the way, one thing is like, did he take advantage and get money from the government to make this?
Sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, the government, part of what was happening with the Federal Theater Project was just as they were looking at out-of-work coal miners or out-of-work factory workers, they were looking at out-of-work actors and writers, and they're trying to help them out. But Orson is also doing a thing that he did throughout his career, which is if the play was running out of money, he paid for it out of his own pocket.
Yes.
Over and over again.
Very true.
Is that there was no sense of self-preservation. He was just, we need to do this, here's some money.
And that's the next pillar.
Yeah, it's another pillar. And this play is a huge, phenomenal success. Mm-hmm. And one thing, if you've gone to see Shakespeare today, you will frequently see Hamlet set in a Nazi concentration camp, or Midsummer Night's Dream with punk rockers, or that all starts with Voodoo Macbeth. Yeah. Like Orson Welles is the first person to really go, we can take this source material and do it anywhere. He goes on to do Julius Caesar in a fascist society, which is supposed to be an unbelievable production. Yeah. And in terms of lighting, you see a lot of the stuff that we would later see in Citizen Kane.
It's a prescient production because it's also some of the stuff we would see used by Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl to promote, because this is 1938. Hitler isn't even doesn't understand yet fully how to use propaganda and the lights and the presentation of the speeches.
I never thought of it this way before.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is Wells kind of showing, mapping, and Wells is talking about Hitler. He said this on numerous occasions. They knew what Hitler was doing in Germany was terrible. They had heard from their friends who were Jewish what was happening in Germany. So that's what influenced him creating this version. Because if you see some of the pictures, which are available in any of the history books about this production of Julius Caesar that Wells did, you see the lights come from below. And they're like small singular circular lights that light up so that the person seems even darker and more powerful and more brooding. The coats are darker and longer. The boots are there. Everything about that production is supposed to be the harbinger for what he thinks is going to happen in Europe for Hitler. That's how intelligent this man was. Nobody listened, and we got into World War II.
And at the same time he's doing this, he's founding the Mercury Theatre with John Houseman and the Mercury Theatre on the Air, which is this weekly radio show, which I've listened to a ton of them.
Me too, brother.
They're awesome.
They're incredible.
They're dated sometimes. The sound quality is bad, but listening to him put Les Miserables into a 1-hour radio show, or Heart of Darkness, or all of these.
Or Edgar Allan put the Telltale Heart.
Oh, Telltale Heart.
Stuff he does, yeah.
I mean, because he had sound design and music, now working with Bernard Herrmann.
Yes.
People like Joseph Cotton and George Coulouris. Vincent Price was part of the original Mercury Theatre on the Air. And they have these great actors, great music, great sound design, great scripts. And every week they're doing a classic, Tale of Two Cities. And, it's really remarkable. And he's doing this while starring on Broadway in one play, directing on another play, doing The Shadow. I mean, it's crazy. And on his 3 days after his 23rd birthday, his picture is on cover of Time magazine. I mean,
23 years old.
23 years old.
Yeah.
And then he does War of the Worlds.
Yeah. By the way, he was a voracious eater as well. He would eat 3 or 4 meals, 3 or 4 dinners, 3 or 4 dinners at night. And this is to fuel his energy.
Well, you know, in the 7 Deadly Sins, I think we can put gluttony and Orson Welles together.
Yeah, sure.
And probably some other of the sins in there too.
Probably quite a few.
Well, and he would do this constant thing of like he would put on weight and he would booze and eat, and then he would with diet pills and crash diets take it off. And you know, I mean, as a guy who struggled with some of these things myself, I get it.
You both of us have, and as a young man, you can do that. When you get older, it's a lot harder.
Well, that's exactly what we see in Orson Welles.
Yeah.
War of the Worlds, which I'm sure everyone has heard about, is from the H.G. Wells book, but it was done as like a real thing happening in real time. Mm-hmm. And people who did not hear the beginning of it, where he said, we're going to do H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, just thought Martians were invading.
Yeah.
And there was a panic. Now, how big this panic really was, it's hard to know.
It's enough that we still talk about it in 2017.
Yeah.
That's for sure. The legend of it, at least.
Yeah, and if you listen to it, it is really well done.
It cuts in.
Yeah.
As if a regular broadcast is happening, it cuts in, and then it begins this whole thing of this person on the ground talking about what's happening. The Martians, you hear the screams and all this. The sound effects is fantastic.
It's really well
And
done.
he never says when it's over that you've been listening to the Mercury Theatre production of War of the Worlds.
He does at the very end.
Okay,
It's like he comes on the air because they had heard about the panic, and he does say,
"Oh, right, because the panic was happening as they were recording."
Yeah,
that's right.
He says, "I hope you enjoyed our little Halloween gift to you." And of course, at this point, he's one of the most famous people in America, so much so that they put him in a comic book with Superman that I read. And RKO, who is one of the smaller studios, invites him out and gives him this unprecedented thing, which is a 2-picture, total artistic control deal to do whatever he wants.
It's difficult to get Final Cut nowadays.
Yeah.
Can you imagine when there were less studios and more control from the studio heads of things, and they were giving him complete Final Cut on 2 films?
Yeah, no one had it.
Right.
And we're going to go deep into Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
So I want to skip ahead a little bit, but I want to say just this one thing, which is that one of the things we'll talk about as we talk about Kane is that he made this movie loosely based on William Randolph Hearst, one of the most powerful newspaper media people in the world. Mm-hmm. And this is part of what destroyed his career.
Yes.
Is that coming out of Kane, a movie that almost didn't even come out in the theaters, was almost destroyed before anyone saw it. He suddenly is tarnished. Mm-hmm. You know, there was all this hatred of him when he came to Hollywood as the boy genius.
It's jealousy.
Yeah. Well, and I get it too. If you've been like, if you're, you know, if someone comes on, shows up, and someone just hands him, you know, someone showed up at Collider who's 21, and they handed them the top spot and all, you would not be pleased about it.
I would not, but if they were kicking ass while they were doing it, I'd be like, shit. I guess that made sense. Yeah. I'd be mad. Yeah, sure, I'd be mad, but I'd also be like, well, they're fucking great. What can I say?
Well, and there's no question that Orson was, but so he goes off to make his second film. Which
sorry, Steve. You know what's interesting? His granddaughter, Hearst's granddaughter, just married Chris Hardwick from The Nerdist.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, no idea. Oh, that's fascinating. I knew that Chris. I didn't know that's who he married. That's fascinating. So I'm just contemplating the
interesting little geeky
the
world.
meld of one of the modern podcasting empire with the 70 years ago newspaper empire. That's sort of fascinating. He goes off to make Magnificent Ambersons based on the Booth Tarkington book, which he hung out with. Booth Tarkington was a friend of the family as a kid.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And this is one of the first of many just tragic stories.
Yep. Tragic, self-destructive stories. Film's an incredible film. Then for some stupid ass reason, just leaves, goes to Brazil to shoot this thing for Roosevelt, and sends in notes on how to edit the film instead of being there to watch the editing process.
This is where, if you listen to Orson's story, and you go like, well, how much truth is this? Because he has a really good explanation.
Sure.
You know, but he went and he films this film. Robert Wise is editing. They finish a rough cut. And then Roosevelt had asked him to go, as you said, to Brazil. It's the middle of World War II, and this is part of our hemisphere cooperation deal. And he's going to make this movie called It's All True. Right. And It's All True, which there's a documentary on it. Have you seen it, I assume?
Yeah.
It's also really good. Mm-hmm. It's All True was supposed to be about Latin American, 3 Latin American stories, one of which was a story in Mexico that he was not directing. Mm-hmm. One was a documentary about samba and carnival in Rio. And the other one was a recreation of a basically a journey on on raft by these native fishermen who are the jangadieros. I probably pronounced that terribly.
I'm sure you did it right.
Sure.
Dongueros, that sounds right.
Yeah. Anyway, they had, this is for real, that to protest the policies of Brazil, they had sailed like 1,400 miles on an open raft to go into Rio Harbor.
Wow.
And so he wants to recreate this journey with the actual guys, the actual fishermen who did it, the real people. So he's down in Brazil. Robert Wise is cutting Ambersons. They send him a cut of Ambersons, which he hates. He sends notes back, but he doesn't come back. Everyone in Hollywood thinks he's just partying and getting drunk in Carnival.
Right.
Which probably to some degree he is. He sends them a bunch of color footage with no sync sound of Carnival. And the studio heads see it, and their response to it, and I will not use the language that they used, is, this is a bunch of N-words dancing. What is all this stuff?
Whoa.
So they go, they take all the money away from Orson. And they say, we don't trust you. You can't be doing this. In the meantime, and this is what Orson says, but part of this I noted, he's filming this thing with the jangadieros as they... And the first thing he films is the end, which is their arrival in Rio Harbor. And he has these 4 guys who really made this journey, who are these native fishermen from way up north. And he films them coming into the harbor, and there's a big wave from like a big ship that goes by, knocks them off the boat. One of the men, who's the leader, hits his head and drowns.
Wow.
Dies.
Holy crap.
So Orson goes, a man died filming this film. I have to stay and continue making the film. This is what his story is. So he goes up, and all he can get from the studio is a 30-year-old silent film black and white camera.
Yeah.
So he and 2 or 3 other guys go up to 1,400 miles to this location and just start filming stuff to film this story, because he feels he has to honor this guy who died to complete the film. And that is why he does not come back to Ambersons. You look skeptical.
Of course I'm skeptical, because I think Orson was the kind of guy who would talk himself into or out of anything. And he's one of those people you meet in life. And I've met these people in life that will create any excuse or reason, find a sanctimonious excuse or reason that makes them seem like the hero, and they're the victim to the power or the elite or whatever it is that they are currently claiming is abusing them or not understanding them. I've seen this happen so many times with people who are narcissists. It's how they exist. They create the enemy, then they create the nobility within themselves for what they were doing. If a man died, maybe, and I guarantee you, he didn't check the waves, didn't check to see what could have happened, didn't check the ship was coming, didn't do any of that, because that's what the wave.
He's not a responsible person.
Right, he's not a responsible person. He just wants to shoot. And this idea of by covering it by saying, "Oh, no, I have to finish this film." Bullshit. Your first commitment was to finish Ambersons, and you should have gone up there and finished it. But the truth was, I think he was afraid to finish it because he was afraid he might not reach the levels that he reached with Citizen Kane, so he copped out.
Well, and this is why I completely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can never really know.
No, of course not.
But the reason I agree is that if you look at the rest of his life, he is continually not finishing and running away from, or obsessively not completing projects over and over again. So
insane.
Like, if this was a one-time thing, I would be totally on Orson's side. But because it's not, and we see it with Touch of Evil, we see it with Other Side of the Wind, with all these other projects over and over again. It's like, dude, what are you doing?
Right.
And while he's away, the studio cuts out 60 minutes or something of Ambersons, shoots a new happy ending, and releases like a 90-minute version. And what's really tragic is that is gone. That footage is gone. No one. There's always
minutes,
this.
Right.
Yeah, we will never ever see what Orson's vision of that film is.
No, there is the 60 minutes have been like transcribed or
There's
whatever.
A script.
There's a script for exactly, so you could see it. But even with the cut, it was still considered a fantastic film.
I really like him. There are things in Ambersons that are just amazing.
Yes, a lot of those dinner table scenes are like phenomenal.
Yeah, it's and what Orson says is that the combination of It's All True and Ambersons broke him. That's what he says. Yeah. He says when he came to Hollywood to do Citizen Kane, he believed he could do anything.
Right.
And from this point forward, he didn't.
Right. But this is also a man that was not sitting around wallowing in his own pity.
Oh,
this man was romancing half of Hollywood, eating, drinking, enjoying the life and luxury of being a star, of being pampered, of being, I mean, like you said, we're going to get into it, but the battles he had with Mankiewicz about Kane, all of that is there's a certain part of his personality that feels he deserves all these accolades, deserves the ability to do all these things that he's doing. And then, of course, I broke me. All of this broke me. Well, it didn't break you when you were, sleeping around. Didn't break you when you were drinking like crazy and having all those kind of jazz. So
Wait, you're saying that people that are obsessively having sex and drinking too much aren't broken?
No, I'm saying don't give me the poor me attitude if you're off having fun every night.
Sure. Well, and this guy's a workaholic. I mean, what we should say is that it's not that he's ever lazy.
No.
Because as soon as he comes back, he is doing radio shows. He raised huge amounts of money for war bonds. He's traveling all over. I mean, the guy is working and working. He does Journey into Fear. He does, he is never stops working through his whole life.
Does
magic shows.
Yeah, all that.
He goes to make his next Hollywood movie is The Stranger.
Yes.
Which I find to be a mixed film.
Yeah. I think it's a precursor for what we're going to see from a number of his films going forward.
And this is a movie where he thought he was like, I'm going to just finish this on time and under budget, and which he does. Yeah. But then the movie gets taken out of his hands and edited in a way he doesn't like. The next one he does is Lady from Shanghai, which has great stuff in it, including probably one of the most remarkable scenes ever shot, which is the Hall of Mirrors scene at the climax.
Yeah, with Everett Sloan.
With Everett Sloan, who's great.
He's fantastic.
Yeah. And Rita Hayworth.
This is used by one of your heroes, Bruce Lee, in Enter the Dragon.
That's right. And really, to be frank, the Bruce Lee one does not compare to what Orson does. And it's with his then wife, Rita Hayworth.
Yes.
And again, this is a movie that is taken out of his hands, and he this is the end of his time in Hollywood. Really, he makes Macbeth next. And this is what we're going to see. And I don't know how you feel about it, but to me, most of the Orson Welles movies, other than Kane, are always kind of watching a movie with an asterisk. It's always like, look at this brilliant thing. Oh, yeah, he probably wasn't able to do that the way he wanted.
Right. To me, it's Kane, Touch of Evil.
Right.
And then everything else is a middling to good film, and sometimes not so good. And I think we can't go past Lady from Shanghai without mentioning the fact that he drove Rita insane. And he did. And part of the reasons why he got excommunicated in Hollywood was he took one of their great stars in Rita Hayworth, seduced her, married her, cut her hair, which is what she was known for Gilda and everything, then put her blonde. The studio head went insane.
Right.
I forget if it was Roy Cohn or somebody went insane.
I think so, because it's Columbia. Yeah,
yeah.
Right.
So he was so upset at what he'd done, and this was Welles' way of exerting his power, using this woman as a battlefield for his war with Hollywood. And this is what he does constantly: uses people, abuses people, steps on them, hurts them. You can still revere this man, incredible talent. I do. I idolize him at times, but you can't remove the flaws of a man like this, the greatness of him, because of his narcissism. He did not see people 100% as they were. He saw them as things he could use or abuse, or or go to and beg sympathy for or care for. And Rita was one of those people who really got sacrificed and changed. She was really destroyed by that relationship, and you read about it in numerous accounts of her life.
Well, and this is the thing we have to remember about this guy, and you see a lot of this in Citizen Kane.
Yes,
he is one of the most charismatic, charming, intelligent, talented, huge personality, persuasive, powerful people that you could ever meet, and he left a lot of broken stuff in his wake, and it's like, and I've been around some people like this, not at the Orson Welles level,
right?
But I've been around some people like this, and it's like, how do you deal with them? They're going to do what they're going to do.
Oh yeah. Irrelevant of how you feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I agree with you to go back to the movies thing that you said, Steve. Yeah, for me, this is the problem I have with Welles, especially with Lady from Shanghai. Some of those close-ups are really useless, and I don't know why people like them. They're terrible to me, and they take me out of the movie, and then some of the other shots are amazing. Same thing with Macbeth. And this is what we start to see, too, with his films. He takes longer to finish these films because money runs out. He has to go do these other parts, which are beneath him as an actor, talent-wise, but he does them to fund these films so he can finish these films. So it is a constant cycle for him.
Yeah, well, like with Othello, which is what he makes next, it takes 2+ years to make.
Yeah,
and he films it in Europe, in Italy, in Africa, and there were times where he would leave his cast because he ran out of money, like in a hotel in Africa, fly back to the United States, do a couple of parts in a movie, do a few radio ads, do a commercial, a TV spot, and then come back, get them out of the hotel in order to keep filming. There are scenes in Othello where one side of a conversation is shot in Italy, and the other side of the conversation was shot a year later in Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, and it shows. And again, Othello is a movie where I go, there are moments where I'm like, this is the most gorgeous shot I've ever seen.
Right.
This performance, this moment, this thing is beautiful. And this is just, I don't know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, but none of them, for me, Othello or Macbeth, of the Shakespeare stuff, come close to Chimes at Midnight. Chimes at Midnight is the one that I think is the closest he ever came to Citizen Kane. And that's one of the ones I revere greatly. But yes, Macbeth and Othello, issues all over the place with some of it. But when he gets those quiet moments, it's really great. Like the scenes with Desdemona are fantastic. So you know he's a master filmmaker. He's just hamstrung by his own shit and by money.
Can I make a horrible confession to you?
Yes.
I haven't seen Chimes at Midnight.
What?
I know.
Steve, you can take my Blu-ray home.
I haven't. No, I bought it. I bought it, the Criterion one, in the last sale.
Okay.
And I've been kind of going like, I assume we're going to do it at some time. I know that you love it. I've been meaning to watch it forever.
You're driving me insane. I did not know. You've caused a fracture in our Wells friendship right now. I did not know you'd never seen that one. Brother, when they reissued that, I went to see that at the John Kennedy Performing Arts Center in D.C.
Wow.
I drove myself down there in like early 92, 93, 94. You sat in bleachers in a room and they showed you the film, the print of the film that had been just discovered. And I couldn't believe it. You know, my mom's like, "Where are you going?" Driving into DC at 7:30 at night. And it was, you know, but that film has put its hooks in me and I watch it all the time.
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize.
I know I've hurt our friendship.
Don't. Now I'm looking forward to hear what you think when you see it.
No, I'm sure. It's funny. I've seen pieces of it, and but it keeps escaping me, as we said many times.
Yeah. And for anyone listening to us, it is Henry IV Part 1 and 2 and Henry V all in one movie
with some Merry Wives of Windsor in it. And it's because he kind of puts together the story of John Falstaff.
Yeah, Falstaff.
Yeah. And it's supposed to be, it's his favorite film. And
it's easy to see what.
Yeah. And there are all these other films, like he was making a Don Quixote that never got finished.
Yes.
They shot for years.
Yep.
And finally he comes back to Hollywood to do Touch of Evil, which if you want to know more about Touch of Evil, you can listen to our podcast on it. Go into a lot of detail on it.
We do.
And he does the same thing, though. The movie is done. There's a cut, and he leaves.
Yeah.
And they finish it without him. And fortunately, Walter Murch comes in and recuts it to his what we think he would have wanted.
But he recruits Heston.
Yeah.
Because Heston is the one who recruited him to be on the film, but he recruits Heston to fight against the studio about giving him final cut. It's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah. And then there's, all of but I didn't, because I went through kind of his Wikipedia article, which is really long. There are so many Orson Welles pilots for television and French shows, and he is trying to do a sketch comedy show, and so many of these things have never seen the light of day.
He's incredibly funny, man.
He's very funny.
If you I recently discovered a talk show appearance he did as a host where he's interviewing Andy Kaufman.
I saw it.
Yeah, you watched
it recently, like a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating because Andy Kaufman reveres him.
Yeah,
and that comes through. And then Wells totally understands and appreciates Kaufman's subversive humor and where he's coming from. So it was fascinating to see two people who some people consider Kaufman a comedic genius, and a lot of people consider Wells a movie genius or film genius, to see them having this conversation about it.
What's interesting about that, it is the most honest I've ever seen Andy Kaufman.
Agreed.
Because most of the time we see Andy Kaufman interviewed, you don't know what's happening.
No.
And this actually seemed like a really disarmed person, so in awe of the person he's with that he was actually being himself.
Well, listen, when you're a trickster, you can't trick the master trickster. And you have to give reverence.
Well, and speaking of tricksters, F is for Fake.
Oh, yes.
Is his essay, documentary, poetic.
Sure.
It's kind of a fascinating movie. You don't love it.
It's not one of my favorites. Yeah. His 70s stuff doesn't really connect with me. F for Fake, and then what's the other one he did? The Odyssey, the Journey, the Long, or the Odyssey. What is the Immortal Story? I don't like Immortal Story either. Those are not ones that I think the 70s is like a waste of time for 10 years for him.
Well, at that point he's still spending 8 or 9 years trying to make The Other Side of the Wind, starring John Huston, a movie that we'll never see, and it's sad. I mean, here's this great genius. I don't think anyone argues that, who for some reasons beyond his control and a lot of reasons within his control just never gets to, he peaks at 25. Yeah.
To me, if you watch, that's what's so tragic about Kane. When you watch Kane, that's really him.
Yeah.
That's really him. That's really Orson Welles' life. He is showing you his life at 25, what his life is going to be like. And I wonder how much that film haunted him every day of his life and may have influenced his behavior and his actions. as he went forward in life. I don't know, but it's certainly, you can make a case.
I can't imagine. I mean, I just can't imagine being this person who literally could do anything and then was trapped by themselves and by the world. And
even 40 years later, people are asking you about a film you did when you were 26 because nothing you've done comes close to what you did when you were 25 or whatever, 24.
Yeah.
It's insane.
No, it's crazy. You have final thoughts on Orson Welles?
Are we ending now?
I don't know.
There's so much more to talk about.
Okay, what do you want to talk about?
Well, I mean, there's so much with him as he progresses through, like the weight issues that he had. There was a lot of that really echoed into his work. But what he also did was he gave some incredible interviews, and so I would suggest
that's a great point.
Right, I would suggest if you're a person who loves Shakespeare, go on YouTube. You can watch numerous interviews with Orson Welles, both in black and white and color.
Do you see the one with Peter O'Toole?
Yes,
that one is so great.
That is so worth your time, where he discusses Shakespeare. And this is a man, and this is why. And when you watch him, you understand why people revere him the way they do, because he has such an incredible knowledge of Shakespeare, intrinsic understanding of Shakespeare, bone deep in his body. So when he talks about it, it's incredible to hear that. Of course, you can Peter Bogdanovich compiled a book of interviews he did
it's
with
a great
him,
one.
which is fantastic.
This is Orson Welles.
This is Orson Welles, right? My friend Clay just sent me Young Orson, which came out in hardback a few months ago, which is another exploration of his younger years. And then there's another one that just came out that I went to go see and get signed by the author of Welles's Conversations with a French director. I can't remember who the director is, and it's all a series of lunches that were documented and compiled by this person into a book.
Well, this is the thing, and I've heard this description of him many times, that he was the most interesting dinner guest anyone could ever sit with.
I'm sure.
That his storytelling, his sense of humor, his erudition, his wit, sense of humor and wit are redundant, and that's something Orson would never have done at the dinner table.
Right.
I mean, he just is endlessly fascinating. And I read the Bogdanovich one, and this is where you're just swept up in his versions of the reality. He's just a great storyteller.
Well, people say to me, people ask you every once in a while in life, like, if you could have dinner with 5 people or 4 people, who would it be? My top 2 are always Orson Welles and Abraham Lincoln at the same table. Because I think if anybody...
Lincoln wouldn't get a word in.
Well, maybe. But I also think Lincoln would destroy Welles in a way Welles had never been, because he wasn't about the braggadocio. It was about the undercutting stuff. And Lincoln would be smart enough to know how to deprogram Welles.
Plus, my guess is that Welles idolized Lincoln.
Would revere him and let him speak, yes.
Yeah, well, he claimed that Gideon Welles, who was in Lincoln's cabinet, is one of his ancestors, which is not true. It's not true. Someone checked it.
Can you imagine? And well, I mean, like people see him in the Muppet movie. They see him as the voice of what, Omnicron or Unicron
on Transformers.
Transformers movie. You know, there's a whole world to explore with Orson. And the thing that's interesting about Orson Welles is the tragedy is never far behind the success. Always throughout his life, much like Kane, the tragedy is never that far behind the success, and always swallows him up. Always.
Yep.
I mean, it's the shame.
It's funny for me, you know, there are these people that we talk about that were taken away too young.
Yeah.
You know, like James Dean or John Kennedy or Bruce Lee. And you ask the question, what if? Orson Welles was not taken away too young. And yet in some ways you kind of are still asking the same question. Is that what could he have done? You know, what could have been his next movie?
Yeah.
And I think part of the fascination with him is we don't get it.
Yeah, and for me, Steve, the thing I've started to ask myself as I revisit my feelings on Welles over the last couple of years is, what if Kane had been stopped from being released? What if Kane had not become the greatest film ever made? What if it had never been released? How different is the world, and how different is Orson's life? Is he more vigilant to finish the things because that one thing that was great got away from him? It motivates him to finish the films instead of this great thing that he did that he was never able to live up to in his own mind, possibly the greatness of it. And maybe the Mankiewicz contribution kind of ate away at him, that he needed that, even though he denigrated Mankiewicz through the whole process, that maybe he realized he wasn't as great in film as he was in theater, because he always needed someone. Like he needed Houseman in theater, he needed Mankiewicz in film, and maybe he hated the fact that he couldn't quite do it fully on his own.
So there's a lot of fascinating stuff in what that I'm just thinking about and what you just said. The first thing is the what if Kane never came out? I mean, that's honestly the story of everything else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like is that in Citizen Kane, in the long run, he won the battle. In Amber Sins and Touch of Evil and all these other ones and all these things that never came out, he lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. It's interesting also that he always put himself in situations where he would have to face these things.
Yeah.
Like why? I mean, I'm really glad he made Citizen Kane, but why make it about William Randolph Hearst?
Right.
Like why not? Why do that? You know you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
And the other thing that I think is really interesting in what you said, I think might be is really, really true, is that on Kane, he had Robert Wise, who would go on to be a great director. Yes. He had a fantastic cast. He had
Greg Toland.
Yeah, Greg Toland, the great cinematographer of the time. He had Bernard Herrmann. He had all these incredibly talented people. Yeah. As he goes forward, he doesn't actually surround it. He becomes much more of a one-man band. And so I wonder if you're absolutely right, is that he did resent because the reality of film, and really the same was true in theater and radio, these are collaborative art forms. You can't do them on your own.
Right.
You know, even if you're a genius, like Orson Welles clearly is.
Right.
Yeah.
But he did inspire slavish devotion from his actors, which is incredible that these actors would wait years to finish these Shakespearean adaptations, and they would, like, at a moment's notice, would drop whatever they were doing to fly, to be flown to finish these films off in Africa and Italy and what you were saying.
And it's not like he was nice.
No, that's the thing. If you read his biography, he was not a nice director at times.
I mean, I think he had what I would describe as fairly typical alcoholic narcissistic behavior, which is he was probably unbelievably nice and warm and supportive, and then would rip you to pieces and destroy you, and just when you were about to leave, he would be unbelievably caring and loving to bring you back, and then the cycle would start over.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, final thoughts on Orson Welles?
Those were our final thoughts, to be honest with you. Yeah.
So I think that's sort of our introduction to Orson Welles. We're going to continue this as we dig really deep into Citizen Kane. As always, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on YouTube, on TuneIn, on Spotify. You can leave comments there. You can leave reviews there. You can visit our Facebook page at the Cine-Files. You can buy movies, of which we talked about a whole bunch, but they're mostly not available except Touch of Evil on our website, cinephiles.net. As always, you can reach me at SR Morris on Twitter. John, where can they reach you?
You guys can always reach me at The Roca Says on Twitter and on Instagram.
And I think that's it for this week. We will see you next week for Citizen Kane on the Cine-Files.